They had nothing left. No grain in the barrel, no neighbors close enough to hear a cry for help, and a winter bearing down on Wyoming like something with a grudge. Rowan Mercer stood at the edge of his property in the dying light of an October afternoon and watched his geese, his stupid, ordinary geese, walk calmly into the side of a mountain and disappear. Not scatter, not panic. Walk in. Like they'd done it 1,000 times before and expected him to figure it out on his own. He almost turned back. He almost didn't follow. That decision, that one small moment of stubbornness against his own fear, would change everything. If you've never seen a story about survival, patience, and what a flock of birds can teach two desperate people about the meaning of enough, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The geese were Tessa's idea, same as most things that turned out to matter. She'd bought the small flock the previous spring from a farmer outside Laramie who was selling off everything before heading back east. A man with soft hands and a bitter mouth who told her the territory would take more than it gave. Tessa had smiled at him and counted out her coins and loaded the birds into the back of their wagon without a word. She'd been raised in a household where people who quit got to watch other people live, and she wasn't interested in becoming that kind of cautionary tale. That was 8 months ago. Now it was the middle of October 1881, the sky the color of hammered pewter from breakfast to supper, and the homestead outside Clearwater Hollow in Wyoming Territory was down to a pair of mules, 11 geese, half a root cellar of vegetables she wasn't confident would stretch to March, and a husband who hadn't slept more than 4 hours in a row since August. Rowan Mercer was not a man who complained. That was something Tessa had appreciated about him when they'd married. His particular kind of quiet that came from processing things instead of performing them. But lately that quiet had a different texture. It had weight. It sat at the supper table with them and ate more than either of them did. "You're doing it again," Tessa said one evening, not looking up from the sock she was mending. The lamp on the table threw uneven light. Outside, the wind shoved against the cabin walls with a sound like a man testing a door he wasn't sure he had permission to open. "Doing what?" "Calculating. I can hear it." Rowan turned his coffee cup in his hands. It had been empty for 20 minutes. "We've got maybe 10 weeks of proper food. If the winter runs long, it won't." Tessa. "It won't," she said again, and the firmness in her voice wasn't denial so much as decision. She bit off the thread and held the sock up to the light. "We've made it through worse." "We haven't, actually." He said it gently. "This is the worst." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. His face was thinner than it had been last spring. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there at their wedding 2 years ago. The territory had put them there, one sleepless night at a time, and she hated it a little, the way the land just took from a person without asking. "Then we figure something out," she said. "We always do." He nodded, but she could tell he wasn't sure he believed it this time. The geese had started disappearing in early October, around the 5th or 6th of the month, though Rowan hadn't noticed the pattern until a week later. He'd assumed at first that they were ranging wider as the grazing dried up. Geese did that, worked outward in expanding circles when the close grass was gone. He'd find them down by the creek sometimes, or near the old fence line where clover still came up if you looked hard enough. But one afternoon he counted them coming back to the yard and came up short. 2 missing. Then the next day, 5. By mid-October, the entire flock was vanishing for 2 to 3 hours every afternoon, between roughly 1 o'clock and the hour before dark, and coming back calm and unhurried, not the way birds moved when they'd been scared or chased. He mentioned it to Tessa on a Tuesday. "You sure you're counting right?" she asked. "I know how to count to 11. She pulled her coat tighter and stepped outside with him. The afternoon had that particular stillness that came just before the first real cold settled in. No wind, just a heavy, waiting quiet. The mountains to the west were already showing white on their upper shoulders, permanent white, the kind that didn't melt until June. They stood in the yard and watched. 3 geese pecked at the frozen ground near the fence. 2 more sat by the water trough. The others were simply not there. "Where do they go?" Tessa asked. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. I tracked them one day last week, got as far as the juniper stand at the base of the North Ridge before I lost them in the brush." She looked north toward the ridge. It was maybe a 1/4 mile from the cabin. the base of the mountain they'd never had much reason to explore. Rocky ground, dense with old juniper trees, not good for farming or grazing. They'd filed on 160 acres, and most of what was worth anything sat south and east of the cabin. The ridge side was just mountain. "You want to follow them today?" she said. "I do." "Then let's follow them today." He looked at her. "It'll be cold." "Rowan, I know it'll be cold. I live here." They went out just before 1 in the afternoon, Tessa in her heavy wool coat and Rowan in his canvas work jacket over 2 flannel shirts, and they positioned themselves near the water trough where 3 geese were standing and doing the particular thing geese did when they were about to move. That slight collective restlessness, a subtle shifting of weight and direction. Rowan had grown up on a farm in Missouri, and he knew animals well enough to understand that they were never as random as they looked. There was intention in them, patterns worn smooth by repetition. You just had to watch long enough to see it. The geese began moving at 10 minutes past 1. Not all at once. That would have been too obvious. They moved in small groups of 2 and 3, unhurried, heading north toward the tree line without any apparent signal. If Rowan hadn't been watching for it, he might have thought they were just wandering. He touched Tessa's arm, and they followed at a distance, staying low where the ground allowed, stepping through the dry grass that crunched underfoot no matter how carefully they tried. "Try not to sound like a horse," Tessa murmured. "I don't sound like a horse." "You sound like a horse on gravel." The geese didn't seem to notice or care. They moved steadily north through the last of the open ground, into the scattered juniper at the base of the ridge. The trees here were old and dense, their trunks twisted into shapes that looked almost intentional, bark peeling in long strips, the smell of them sharp and medicinal in the cold air. Rowan and Tessa pushed through the outer edge of the grove, branches scraping at their coats, and then stopped. The geese were gone. Not into the air. Neither of them had heard the sound of wings, just gone, between one stand of trees and the next, as if the mountain had simply taken them. "They couldn't have gone up," Tessa said, looking at the rock face above. The ridge here was nearly vertical, old gray limestone, no path a goose could climb. Rowan moved forward carefully, stepping over exposed roots, ducking under a low branch, and then stopped again. He was standing before the base of the cliff, and at first it looked like solid rock. Then he shifted his angle slightly and saw it. A crack. It ran vertically from just above knee height to a point about 6 feet up, barely wider than a man's shoulders at its widest, and slightly wider at the bottom where it met the ground. The juniper trees grew so close on either side that if you weren't looking for it, if you were approaching from any other angle, you'd walk right past it. He'd walked past it every time he'd come to this end of the property, which wasn't often. He crouched and pressed his hand into the gap. Warm air moved over his fingers. Not the faint warmth of sun-heated stone. Real warmth, steady and dry, moving from somewhere deep inside. "Tessa." His voice came out quieter than he intended. She crouched beside him and felt it. He watched her face change. "That's not—" "No," he said. "It's not." They looked at each other in the last of the afternoon light filtering through the juniper branches, and for a long moment neither of them said anything useful, because there wasn't anything useful to say. A crack in the side of a mountain with warm air flowing from it, and a flock of geese that had been walking into it every afternoon like it was the most natural thing in the world. "We need a candle," Tessa said finally. "We need more than a candle. We need a candle first." They didn't go in that day. By the time they'd found the crack and confirmed it was real, and not some heat mirage their cold-starved brains had conjured up, the light was already going, and neither of them was reckless enough to squeeze into an unknown passage in the side of a mountain in the dark. They marked the location. Rowan broke a branch and wedged it into the rock face at eye height, white wood showing through the bark. And they walked back to the cabin in silence that had a different quality now than the silence they'd brought with them. It wasn't the silence of calculation. It was the silence of something opening up. Tessa made supper without speaking much, just the sounds of the cast-iron skillet and the fire and the wind outside. Rowan sat at the table and sharpened his knife, which he didn't need to sharpen, and thought. "What do you think is in there?" Tessa asked, setting a plate in front of him. "I don't know." "Guess." He picked up his fork. "Cave, most likely. Wyoming's full of them, especially in limestone country like this. The warm air could mean geothermal, hot springs maybe, or just deep enough that the earth keeps it steady. And the geese know about it. The geese definitely know about it. He ate in silence for a moment. They weren't afraid, Tessa. That's the thing that keeps hitting me. Animals go into dangerous places afraid. Horses, dogs, even cattle. You can see it in them. These geese walked in like they were coming home. Tessa sat down across from him and wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. So what do we do? Tomorrow I go in. We go in. He looked at her. Don't, she said before he could start. Don't do the thing where you try to protect me from something interesting. It could be unstable. The passage could close, or there could be, I know what could happen. I'm going with you. She held his gaze. Both of us go in, or neither of us does, and then we spend the rest of the winter wondering. He thought about arguing. He was tired of losing those arguments, though, and more than that, he understood that she was right. If something happened to him in there, she needed to know what she was dealing with. 2 sets of eyes were better than 1, and honestly, he didn't want to see whatever was in there without her. Fine, he said. Fine, she agreed, and went back to her supper. They prepared that evening with the particular care of people who understood that preparation was the thing that stood between a good story and a bad one. Tessa melted tallow and made 3 new candles, thick ones, setting them into the old tin holders they used when the lamp oil ran low. Rowan checked the rope, 40 feet of good hemp, nothing frayed, and coiled it neatly. He packed the satchel, candles, flint, the rope, a short-handled hatchet, 2 apples, and a full water skin. That feels like a lot, Tessa said. Better to carry more than need it than carry less and wish you hadn't. She nodded, practical agreement. She added the wool blanket from the chest at the foot of the bed, rolling it tight and strapping it to the outside of the satchel with a piece of leather cord. Rowan didn't question it. They went to bed early, and neither of them slept particularly well. Rowan lay on his back in the dark and listened to the wind work its way around the cabin and thought about the warm air moving over his hand, that steady, quiet exhalation from deep inside the mountain, like the rock itself was breathing. Tessa lay beside him with her eyes open and thought about the geese, the specific calm of them, the way they'd moved without hurry or hesitation into a crack in the world. She'd grown up being told that fortune came to those who worked hard and waited patiently, which she'd always thought was true enough, but incomplete. Fortune also came to people who followed their geese into mountains when common sense said to stay home. She fell asleep around midnight with that thought sitting comfortably in her chest. Morning came gray and still, the kind of October day in Wyoming where the cold sits flat and even from first light, no drama to it, just a steady, patient wait. They ate breakfast quickly, oatmeal, coffee, 2 biscuits left from the night before, and dressed in layers. Tessa braided her dark hair and pinned it close to her head, practical. Rowan pulled his boots on and laced them twice. They walked north through the frost-stiff grass as the sun came up behind the overcast, throwing pale, directionless light across the frozen yard. The mules watched them from the fence with expressions of deep philosophical indifference. "Morning," Tessa said to them, out of habit. The mules offered nothing in return. The juniper grove felt different in the morning light, or maybe they were just seeing it differently now that they knew what was in it. The trees were the same, old, dense, their roots working into the rock face like patient fingers. The cold had stiffened the branches overnight, and they pushed through with more noise than Rowan would have liked. He found the marked branch easily enough and turned toward the crack in the rock. It looked smaller in the morning somehow, or maybe it was just that they were actually about to go into it, and the body had opinions about things the mind was committed to. "You first," Tessa said. "Thanks. You're broader. If you fit, I fit." He couldn't argue with the logic. He took the satchel off and held it in front of him, then turned sideways and pushed into the gap. It was tight. There was a moment, his chest against cold stone on one side and rough limestone on the other, his face turned up toward the sky he could no longer see, where he was acutely aware that this was an unusual and possibly poor decision. Then the passage widened slightly, and he took a breath that actually filled his lungs and kept moving, 5 feet in, 10. His shoulder scraped the right wall. He stopped, got his bearings, moved forward again. And then the passage opened. Not gradually, all at once. One moment he was pressed between walls of rock, and the next he was stepping out into open air and darkness, and the open air was warm, genuinely warm, the kind of warmth that went into the bones instead of just sitting on the skin. He stood still for a moment, breathing it. "Rowan?" Tessa's voice from behind him, muffled by stone. "I'm through. Keep coming." He heard her in the passage, the scrape of boots, a small sharp sound as she caught her coat on something. And then she was beside him, and he struck the flint and lit the first candle. The flame went still. No draft. The air moved here, but gently, from somewhere below them, and it carried warmth without carrying a chill. In the candlelight, they saw it. The chamber was enormous. Rowan had been in caves before, a few limestone holes back in Missouri as a boy, the kind that smelled of bat and old damp. And they had been low, cramped things, hostile to the human body. This was nothing like that. The ceiling rose 12, maybe 15 feet overhead in places, the stone dome of it smooth and pale gold in the candlelight, marked with the slow, patient work of water over ages. The floor was uneven but navigable, rising in gentle terraces that caught and held the candle's glow. And the eggs. They both saw them at the same moment and stood still. In the natural stone hollows, dozens of them, carved by water into the terraced floor of the cave, each one fitted to its purpose like something deliberate, lay eggs. Hundreds of them. The geese had packed them in layers, the older ones pressed to the sides of each hollow, the newer ones centered, the whole arrangement speaking to a system that had been working far longer than either of them had been alive. The geese themselves were here, most of the flock gathered in the upper terraces where the warmth was strongest, watching the two humans with the incurious calm of animals who have been safe for so long that safety has become their default setting. "They've been doing this for years," Tessa said, and her voice came out hushed without her meaning it to. "Look at the stone. The hollows didn't form around their nests. They found hollows that were already the right shape. They chose this place." Rowan held the candle higher and turned slowly. The warm air moved past him from somewhere deeper in the rock, and the flame leaned but didn't gutter. The smell was clean, mineral, old, not unpleasant. The whole cave breathed like a living thing. He thought about the temperature. If it stayed constant, and the evidence suggested it did, given the eggs that had been stored here through what must have been multiple seasons, then this cave wasn't just warm. It was a natural refrigerator in summer and a natural warming room in winter. The rock maintained the temperature that the mountain held deep in its bones, and that temperature was apparently exactly what a goose needed. "Tessa," he turned to her. "This cave doesn't freeze." She was already understanding it. He could see it happening in her face. The calculation running behind her eyes. The same kind of calculation that had made her buy geese from a man outside Laramie when most people wouldn't have. "The eggs keep," she said. "The eggs keep," he confirmed. "All winter." The silence that followed was the kind that came before large decisions, before the moment when a life shifted direction. Outside, the wind was beginning to pick up. He could feel the faint pressure change in the cave, the mountain registering what was happening on its surface. Winter coming. Somewhere to the east, their root cellar held vegetables that might last to February if they were careful. Here, in the belly of a mountain their geese had known about since God only knew when, was something else entirely. Tessa walked slowly along the nearest terrace, the candle she'd taken from the satchel casting her shadow large and moving across the cave wall. She bent and examined an egg carefully without touching it, then another. She picked up a third, gently, two-handed, and held it to the candle. The shell was thick, the color of old cream. "These ones here are abandoned," she said. "See how they're pushed to the outer edge? The birds sorted them already." Rowan looked. She was right. In each hollow there was a clear arrangement. The active eggs toward the center, the abandoned or infertile ones displaced to the margins, left there the way birds left things they were done with. "We don't touch the active ones," he said. It wasn't a question. "We don't touch the active ones," she agreed. "Not yet. Not until we understand how many there are, how often new clutches come, what the pattern is." She set the egg back carefully, exactly as she'd found it. "We're going to need to come back. Every day for a week at least. Just to watch." Rowan nodded. He was looking at the ceiling, tracing the watermarks in the stone, the ancient pathways of rain and time. "We need to widen the entrance," he said. "Not much, just enough to get a sled through." "That'll take a week of its own." "I know." "We'll need to be careful not to destabilize the face." "I know." She turned to look at him directly. "Rowan, this could be nothing. The eggs might not stay good, the passage might not be stable enough for weight-bearing. It could be nothing," he agreed, but it doesn't feel like nothing." She looked around the cave, the geese watching them from the upper terraces, the candle flames burning steady in the dead still air, the countless eggs resting in their stone hollows, and she thought about the farmer outside Laramie with his soft hands and his bitter mouth, heading east because the territory had given him nothing. "No," she said. "It doesn't feel like nothing." They spent 2 hours in the cave that first morning, moving carefully along the terraces with their candles, counting and mapping. Tessa had brought a stub of pencil and the back pages of a seed catalog, and she sketched rough maps as they went. The layout of the chamber, the position of the hollows, the number of active nests. Rowan made notes in the margins. The geese tolerated them with the resigned patience of animals that had decided, for whatever reason, that these two particular humans were acceptable. When they emerged back into the cold, blinking in the flat gray light, Rowan had to stand still for a moment and let his mind settle. The scale of what they'd found was difficult to hold all at once. Not treasure in the gold rush sense, no metal, no mineral wealth. Something quieter and more immediate than that. A natural system, ancient and functional, that could be worked with or ruined depending entirely on how they approached it. "We tell no one," Tessa said, not unkindly, as they walked back toward the cabin. "Not yet." "I wasn't planning to." "I know. I'm saying it anyway because I want us both to be clear." She stepped over a frozen rut in the path. "Once people know about something like this, it gets decided by more than 2 people. And right now, it needs to be decided by 2 people who'll treat it right." Rowan understood what she meant. He'd seen what happened when a thing of value became public knowledge before it was properly understood. Claims and arguments, and the particular kind of damage that people did to good things out of a combination of fear and greed. This needed time. It needed to stay quiet. "Just us," he said. "Just us," she confirmed. The cabin came into view through the bare aspens at the edge of the yard, a thin thread of smoke rising from the chimney where they'd banked the fire before leaving. Small, solid, patched in 3 places, surrounded by frozen ground and a sky that promised winter. It looked like exactly what it was, the home of people who were holding on by their fingernails. But something had shifted. Rowan walked toward it differently than he'd walked away from it that morning. Not with optimism exactly, nothing so simple or so fragile as that, but with the specific steadiness of a person who has been handed something real to work with and knows it. The geese were coming back from the cave as they crossed the yard, flowing back through the gap in the junipers in their particular unhurried way, fanning out across the frozen ground without comment, settling back into their afternoon routines as though they'd only been out for a walk. Rowan watched them for a moment. "Smart birds," he said. Tessa stopped beside him and looked at the flock. Her flock. The one she'd bought with careful coins from a bitter man who thought the territory would take more than it gave. "Smartest thing on this property," she said, and went inside to start supper. Rowan stood alone in the yard a moment longer, in the cold and the quiet, with the mountain at his back and the longest winter of his life still ahead of him. Then he followed her in. The days that followed moved with a different rhythm than the days before. Rowan had always been a methodical man, the kind who measured twice, cut once, and was willing to do a job slowly if that was the price of doing it right. Tessa matched him in this, though she came to it differently, through an impatience with failure rather than an instinct for caution. Together, they were careful in a way that neither might have managed alone. Every afternoon between 1 and 3, while the geese made their daily pilgrimage to the cave, Rowan and Tessa followed and worked. The first week was observation only, Tessa's decree, which Rowan respected because she was right. They sat in the cave with their candles and their pencil and their seed catalog, and they watched and mapped and counted. They identified 23 active nesting hollows, each containing between 4 and 9 eggs. They noted which birds nested where, learned the hierarchy of the flock, the large dominant female who had claimed the deepest and warmest hollow at the back of the cave, the two younger pairs who nested on the middle terrace, the rest arranged in the descending order of seniority that Geese maintained with quiet, unforgiving precision. The old ones have been coming here longer, Tessa said one afternoon, sketching the dominant female's hollow. You can tell by the stone. The hollows they use are smoother, worn down more. Meaning the flock has been using this cave for at least a couple of generations, Rowan said. At minimum. She added a note in the margin of her map. Which means the eggs in the abandoned sections, she gestured to the outer edges of each hollow where the discarded eggs lay, have been accumulating for years. Rowan had already been thinking about this. The geese, it appeared, were tidy in a particular way. They kept their active nests clean and centered, but they didn't remove the abandoned eggs. They simply displaced them outward, pushed them to the periphery, and left them there. The cave's constant temperature meant those eggs didn't rot in the ordinary way. They dried and cooled and settled into a kind of arrested state, neither fresh nor spoiled in the manner of eggs left in open air. He'd taken one of the peripheral eggs home 3 days ago and cracked it in the skillet at Tessa's insistence. It had been good, not fresh, a little dense, the yolk darker than new-laid, but good, edible, more than edible. The eggs in the outermost margins, the oldest of the abandoned ones, had been in the cave since before either of them had set foot on this property. The mountain had been keeping them all along, waiting for someone sensible enough to use them without destroying the source. The entrance work started in the second week. Rowan's goal was specific and modest. Widen the existing crack by 6 inches on each side without disturbing the structural integrity of the face above it. He worked with a hand drill and a small iron pry bar, not a hammer. He'd decided against hammering after the first day, when the vibration sent a 1/4-inch crack running along the ceiling of the passage inside, a crack that hadn't been there before and that closed his stomach like a fist. "Stop," Tessa had said, hearing the change in the stone, and he had stopped. After that, they worked with patience so extreme it was almost meditative. Rowan would drill a small hole, wait, look, listen. Feel the stone with his palm. Drill another. Tessa held the candle and watched the ceiling and said nothing except when she needed to say something, which she kept to a minimum because she understood that unnecessary talk was a kind of noise, and noise was something the mountain was not interested in. By the end of the second week, the entrance was wide enough for Rowan to pass through upright without turning sideways. It felt like an improvement wildly disproportionate to the effort, which was the way of patient work. The geese, for their part, continued using the cave without apparent disruption. If they noticed the changes to the entrance, they gave no sign. They moved through it daily, returned daily, nested and tended and arranged and sorted with the same indifferent authority they'd brought to the whole enterprise from the beginning. It was on a Thursday in late October, the 24th. Tessa had written it on the board above the fireplace, her habit of keeping track of days, that they finally had the conversation they'd been building toward without quite naming. They were in the cave in the late afternoon. The light outside had been going gray and cold since midday, and the warm air in the cave had a particular comfort to it after a morning spent mending the fence line in a wind that had gone from unpleasant to hostile over the course of 3 hours. Tessa sat on the lower terrace with her catalog maps spread around her, making final notes. Rowan stood near the entrance, looking back at the chamber. "We know enough now," he said. Tessa looked up. 2 weeks, he said. "We know the layout, the nesting patterns, the rate of egg accumulation in the discard sections. We know the temperature holds. We know the entrance is stable." He paused. "We know what we have." Tessa was quiet for a moment. The candle flame sat perfectly still between them. One of the geese shifted in the upper terrace with a soft sound, the brush of feathers on stone. "So what do we have?" she asked. "We have a natural cold storage that doesn't freeze." He said it the way he said everything, plainly, without decoration. "We have a flock that produces eggs and stores the surplus in conditions that keep them viable for months. We have—" He stopped. Tried again. "Tessa, we have enough to last the winter, not just us." She held his gaze. "Enough for— The Pattersons haven't got enough grain to make January. Mrs. Aldrich is alone since her husband passed in September. The Gutierrez family, the new ones over by Flat Creek, they came late in the season and their stores are— Rowan, I know it sounds exactly like what it is, she said. It sounds like we found something we didn't expect. And now we have to decide whether we're the kind of people who sit on it or the kind of people who use it for something. She folded her maps carefully and tucked them into the catalog. I already know which kind of people we are. He looked at her. We're the kind who follow the geese, she said simply. Outside the mountain, the wind picked up, the sound of it audible even here, the faint moan of Wyoming weather doing what Wyoming weather did, winter making its intentions clear. Rowan nodded, once the way he nodded when a thing was settled. They blew out the candles and went back through the passage into the cold, the warm air of the cave following them for a few feet, and then giving out, releasing them back to the world they lived in, where the work was not yet finished and the winter was not yet here, and there was still time, just barely, but still, to prepare. The geese streamed out behind them in the early evening, flowing back across the frozen ground toward the cabin, heading home with the same unhurried certainty they brought to everything. Rowan watched them go. He still didn't entirely understand what he'd done to deserve this. The crack in the mountain, the warm air, the eggs laid up in their careful stone hollows like something put there on purpose. He wasn't sure understanding was the point. Sometimes things happened. You followed your geese, or you didn't. You opened your hands, or you kept them closed. And that decision, that one small insistence against your own fear, or your own greed, or your own disbelief, turned out to be the one that mattered. He walked back to the cabin in the failing light, and behind him the mountain kept its warmth and its secrets, and the particular patience of stone that has always known how to wait. The first snow came on October 28th, 4 days after they'd made their decision in the cave. It wasn't the killing snow. Not yet. It was the warning kind, 2 inches overnight that melted off the south-facing slopes by mid-morning, but stayed packed in the shadows and along the north fence line where the sun didn't reach until nearly noon. Rowan stood on the porch with his coffee and watched it, and did the math he'd been doing every morning for weeks. The involuntary arithmetic of a man who understood that winter didn't care about intentions. The root cellar had potatoes, turnips, dried beans, and a crock of salted pork that would last them to February if they were careful, and to January if they weren't. The grain barrel was low enough that he could see the bottom when he tilted it. 2 mules to feed, 11 geese that seemed to feed themselves on whatever geese found under snow, and a wife who ate less than she should and worked more than she ought to, and never once complained about either. He went back inside and refilled his coffee without saying what he was thinking. Tessa was already at the table with the seed catalog maps spread out, adding to them from memory. She'd been refining the cave charts every morning for a week, transferring the rough sketches into something cleaner and more useful, a record they could actually work from. She had a good eye for spatial things. She'd once told him she'd gotten it from her mother, who could look at a bolt of fabric and tell you within 2 inches how much you'd need for a dress without measuring anything. I want to start harvesting today, she said, not looking up. I was thinking the same. Just the outer margins. The eggs the birds have already sorted out. Right. She looked up then. You were going to say that anyway. I was. He sat down across from her. I want to build the sled first, something narrow enough to fit through the passage, flat-bottomed so it slides on the cave floor without catching. We pack the eggs in straw, layer them, keep the load light enough that one of us can pull it through. Tessa tapped her pencil on the edge of the map. How long to build it? Day and a half, maybe 2 if the wood gives me trouble. The wood will give you trouble. Probably. He drank his coffee. I'll start this morning. She nodded and went back to her maps. Outside, the snow ticked against the window glass in a wind that had picked up since dawn, and the mules made a sound in the barn that meant they wanted their hay, and the day organized itself around the work the way days did out here. Not neatly, not with any particular fairness, but with a kind of relentless forward motion that didn't pause for doubt. The sled took 2 days, as predicted, because the wood gave him trouble. The planks he'd been saving since spring were drier than he'd hoped, and 2 of them split when he tried to plane them down to the width he needed. He had to work around the splits, cutting shorter, adjusting the design as he went. Tessa came out to the workshed on the second afternoon and looked at what he had without comment for a long moment. It's ugly, she said. It works. Those are not mutually exclusive observations. The cave doesn't care what it looks like. She picked up one end and tested the weight. Light, which was the point, and ran her hand along the bottom surface, checking for snags. It'll do, she said, which from Tessa was the same as high praise, and went back inside. He finished it that evening by lamplight, the shed cold enough that his breath came in clouds, his fingers stiff by the time he drove the last peg. It was ugly. It was the right width, the right weight, and the runners were smooth enough to move without catching on the cave floor. Those were the things that mattered. They made their first real harvest run on the morning of October 31st. The passage was easier now that they'd widened it. Rowan could move through without turning sideways, pulling the sled behind him on a rope, feeling it come through the gap with only one small hang-up near the base where the rock still jutted. He filed a mental note to address that later and kept moving. Tessa came through behind him, and they lit their candles and stood in the warm air of the chamber and let their eyes adjust. The geese were already there. Most of them settled in their hollows, doing the calm and ancient work of being geese. The dominant female watched them from the back of the cave with the particular expression geese had that managed to communicate both complete indifference and absolute authority at the same time. "Morning," Tessa said to her. The goose looked away. They moved to the lower terraces first, where the discard margins were deepest, the outer rings of the oldest hollows, eggs that had been pushed to the edge over multiple seasons and left there. Rowan worked slowly, checking each egg before he moved it, turning it in the candlelight to read the color and density of the shell. The good ones went into the straw-lined sled bed, nestled carefully so they couldn't knock together. The ones that were too far gone, he set aside in a cracked clay pot they'd brought for the purpose. Tessa worked the terrace above him in the same methodical way, her movements quiet and deliberate, not disturbing the active hollows, not crowding the birds. She'd developed a sense over the 2 weeks of observation for how close was too close. There was a distance, maybe 4 feet, at which the geese went from tolerant to watchful, and she stayed outside it. They filled the sled in 40 minutes. Not full. Deliberately not full, leaving room for the egg layers to breathe, packing the straw snug but not compressed. When Rowan pulled the sled back toward the entrance, it moved smoothly on the cave floor, the runners doing their job. "How many?" Tessa asked, looking at the load. He counted. 63. She was quiet. "That's one run," he said. "I know." She looked back at the cave, at the dozens of hollows still holding their accumulated surplus, the months and seasons of careful geese work laid up in pale shells and ancient stone. "We could do 2 runs a day, morning and afternoon." "Not every day. We don't want to habituate them to disruption." "Every other day, then." She picked up her end of the sled to help guide it through the passage. "Rowan, if we do this right, if the eggs keep the way the first one did, if we can get them stored in the cabin cold room before the real freeze comes—" "I know," he said. "We'll have more than we can eat." The word more sat between them in the warm cave air, and they both understood what it meant. More than 2 people needed was a different kind of resource than enough for 2 people. It carried a different weight, a different set of obligations. He started backing toward the entrance, pulling the sled. "Every other day," he said. "Starting today." Getting the loaded sled back through the passage was harder than the empty run. The weight shifted, and the hang-up near the base caught one of the runners and nearly tipped the whole thing before Rowan got a hand under it. He held the sled level by main strength while Tessa reached through from the outside and guided the nose of it around the obstruction, the 2 of them working in almost no verbal communication, just occasional short words, left, hold, now, because they'd been working alongside each other long enough that the language between them had been compressed into the essential minimum. They came out into the cold morning blinking, the sled between them, 63 eggs packed in straw, and stood for a moment in the juniper grove while their eyes adjusted to the flat October light. "I'll address that snag this afternoon," Rowan said. "After the cold room," Tessa said. The cabin's cold room was a small stone-walled space off the back of the structure that Rowan had built into the north-facing side of the foundation specifically because it would stay cold through winter without freezing solid, cold enough to preserve things, not cold enough to burst them. He'd never had enough to actually fill it. Now he looked at 63 eggs packed in straw and tried to mentally calculate how many more runs it would take to fill the shelves he'd built and never properly used. A lot more runs. Good. They stacked the first batch on the bottom shelf, careful with the straw packing, and stood back to look at them. The eggs were the color of old cream in the dim light of the cold room, dozens of them sitting in their nests of dry grass, and they looked like something that shouldn't have been there, like a piece of luck that had come in through the wrong door and hadn't quite realized it yet. "They'll keep," Tessa said. It was the third time she'd said it. Rowan understood that she was convincing herself, not him, and he didn't interrupt the process. "They'll keep," he agreed. The days that followed settled into a routine that was hard and specific and clarifying in the way that hard, specific work tended to be. Every other morning, before the light was fully up, they made the trip north through the frozen grass and into the cave and harvested from the discard margins. Always careful, always measured, always reading the birds and the hollows before touching anything. Tessa kept a running count in the catalog, not just of eggs taken, but of the current state of each hollow, the new eggs laid, the old ones displaced, the slow and constant replenishment that the flock was doing on its own without any help or interference from the two humans who came every other day to take what had already been set aside. Rowan addressed the snag in the passage entrance, and then addressed two other smaller problems he found while he was at it, and by the first week of November, the sled moved through the gap cleanly in both directions without needing to be guided or held. He never hammered. He drilled small holes and used the pry bar with a patience that sometimes surprised even him, and he talked to the rock in the way his father had talked to difficult horses. Not out loud, not with words, but with a quality of attention that communicated something. Tessa found him in the passage on a Wednesday afternoon, stopped with his hand flat against the stone above the entrance, eyes closed, doing that thing. "It's a rock," she said. "It's a complex system under load," he said without opening his eyes. "It's a rock. There's a seam here that I don't like. I want to know if it's moving." She looked. She couldn't see anything. "Is it?" "Not today." He opened his eyes and looked at the seam for another moment, then picked up the pry bar. "I'm going to put a timber brace in, just here, just as a precaution." "When?" "This week." "Okay." She went into the cave. He heard her voice from inside speaking to the dominant female goose, who tolerated it. The brace went in on Friday. It wasn't pretty. A heavy pine timber notched into the rock on either side of the passage, supporting the weight of the ceiling at its narrowest point. Rowan spent more time on the notching than on the timber itself, making sure the stone seats were right, that the pressure was even, that the beam would bear load without transmitting vibration to the rock above. When he was done, he pushed on it in several places, and it didn't move, and the seam above it looked exactly the same as it had before. He felt better about it. Tessa ran her hand along the beam when she came through. "Timber's not local," she said. "I used the spare planks from the woodshed. Those were for the barn roof." "The barn roof can wait until spring." She looked at the beam, then at him. "You could have told me you were using those." "I figured you'd rather have a stable cave entrance than a dry barn." "I would. I just would have liked to have been asked." He held her gaze. "You're right. I should have asked." She nodded, accepting that, and moved through into the cave. Rowan followed, listening for any sound from the brace or the stone above it, and hearing none. By the second week of November, the cold room shelves held 412 eggs, packed in straw and arranged by harvest date, the oldest toward the front where they'd used them first. Tessa had started testing them every few days, cracking one from each batch into a bowl before cooking to check the color and consistency of the yolk, writing the results in the back of the catalog in her tight, precise hand. "Good, good. Slightly dense, but fine. Good." Every single one came back good. She told Rowan this on a Saturday evening after supper, reading from the catalog in the lamplight while he mended a crack in his boot sole. "That's 400 eggs," she said, "every one of them viable." He didn't answer immediately. He worked the wax into the leather, pressed the sole back against the upper, held it. "People are going to start running low in December," he said. "Patterson's for sure. I was talking to him at the mill in September, and he was already rationing his grain." "I know. Mrs. Aldrich won't ask for help. She'd starve before she'd knock on a door." "I know that too." Tessa set the catalog down. "So we don't wait for her to knock." "No. We go to her." "Yes." She looked at the fire for a moment, at the way the coals shifted and settled into themselves. Outside, the wind was doing what the November wind did in Wyoming, working steadily, persistently, without drama, but with absolute intent, piling cold against everything that tried to hold against it. "We're going to have to build the sled bigger," she said. Rowan looked up from his boot. "The delivery sled," she said. "The one we used to get around the valley. We'll need more capacity than the current one if we're bringing eggs to 4 or 5 households. He thought about the wood in the shed. He thought about the notched planks. He thought about the barn roof that could wait until spring. I'll start Monday, he said. Good. She picked the catalog back up and wrote something in the back of it, and Rowan went back to his boot, and the fire settled, and outside the wind kept coming, and the mountain kept its warmth deep in its bones, patient as stone, holding what it held. The cold room shelves were not yet full. There was still time, and still work to do. And neither of them was under any illusion that the hardest part of this winter was behind them. But 400 eggs in straw, in a stone room, tested good. That was something. That was in fact quite a lot. The delivery sled came together faster than the cave sled had, partly because Rowan had learned from his mistakes on the first one, and partly because he wasn't trying to make it fit through a mountain this time. He used the good planks, the ones without splits, and built the bed wider and longer, with low side rails to keep the load from shifting on uneven ground. The runners he shaped from a dense piece of ash he'd been saving without knowing what for, bending them slightly at the front so the sled would ride up over packed snow instead of digging in. Tessa watched him work on it one afternoon from the barn doorway, her arms crossed against the cold, and after a while she said, "It's better than the other one. Everything I build is better than the last thing I built." Is that a philosophy or a complaint? It's just true. He tested one of the runners with his weight, found it solid, moved to the other side. "I want to line the bed with oilcloth. Keep the straw dry if the weather turns while we're moving." I was going to suggest that. I know you were. She went back inside. He finished the sled that evening by lantern light, nailed the oilcloth down with small tacks along the rail edges, and stood back and looked at it in the uncertain yellow light. It was not beautiful. It was the right size, the right weight, and it would carry what they needed it to carry without falling apart. He was satisfied with that. The first real blizzard of the season arrived on November 17th without much warning, which was how Wyoming blizzards operated. A gray morning that looked like every other gray morning, then a shift in the wind around 10 o'clock, then by noon a wall of white moving across the valley from the northwest that reduced visibility to 40 feet, and made the distance between the cabin and the barn feel like a different kind of distance than it normally was. Rowan had been watching the sky since breakfast and had moved the mules into the barn before it hit, forked extra hay, checked the water. He came back to the cabin with ice in his beard and snow packed into the collar of his coat and found Tessa standing at the window looking out at the white. "How long?" she asked. 2 days at least. Maybe 3. He shed his coat and shook the snow onto the porch before hanging it. "The temperature's dropping fast. It'll be 10 below by morning." She turned from the window. Her expression wasn't frightened. Tessa didn't do frightened easily. But it had a focused quality, the look she got when she was adding numbers and not liking the sum. "The Pattersons are 6 miles out." "I know. If this runs 3 days and it gets down to what you're saying, I know, Tessa. We can't move while it's blowing like this. No." He pulled a chair close to the fire and sat down heavily, working his boots off. His feet were cold all the way through, the kind of cold that took 20 minutes of sitting still to work out. "We wait until it breaks, and then we move fast." She sat across from him. The fire between them threw uneven light, and the wind outside was a sustained, violent thing, throwing itself against the cabin with the particular fury of weather that didn't understand why structures existed. "How long can they manage?" she asked. "Patterson's resourceful. He's got enough sense to slaughter a pig if he has to." He rubbed his feet through his socks. "Mrs. Aldrich is what worries me. She's been through Wyoming winters before. She's been through them with her husband." He said it plainly, not to be cruel, just because it was the shape of the problem. "This is the first one alone. She's got that small woodpile. I saw it when I rode past in September, and I thought then it wasn't enough, but I didn't want to say anything because she would have told you to mind your business." "Exactly." Tessa looked at the fire for a moment. "We go to her first, when it breaks." "We go to her first," he agreed. The blizzard ran 2.5 days. They spent the time doing what you did during blizzards, tending the animals in short, brutal trips to the barn, keeping the fire fed, working on the indoor jobs that accumulated during busy seasons and got neglected. Tessa darned socks and worked through a pile of mending and reworked the catalog maps with fresh detail, adding notes about the cave in a code only she and Rowan would understand, not names or locations, just symbols and numbers that meant what they meant if you already knew. Rowan sharpened everything that could be sharpened, replaced 3 broken boards on the cold room shelves, and spent an afternoon working on the leather traces for the mules that had been cracking since September. On the second evening, while the wind drove snow hard against the north wall, Tessa looked up from her mending and said, "Are you going to tell me what you're actually worried about?" He didn't look up from the traces. "I'm worried about several things. The specific one, the one you've been sitting with for 2 days." He put the leather down. Outside, the storm pushed and the cabin held, and the fire made the kind of noise fire makes when it's working hard and being appreciated. "What happens when the cave gives out?" he said. Tessa was quiet. "The discard margins won't last forever," he said. "We've taken maybe a third of what's there, maybe less, and the flock keeps adding to it, but there's a rate to that. Spring comes, they lay fresh eggs, but the surplus accumulates slowly. What we're taking this winter is what years of abandonment built up in those hollows, and once it's gone..." He stopped. "It's not going to be the last winter we need it," Tessa said. "No, so we need the flock to grow." He nodded. "Or we find a way to encourage more laying through the winter months, which I don't know how to do, or we..." He picked up the traces again, ran his thumb along a crack in the leather. "I don't know the answer yet. I just know that what we have right now is not permanent, and I don't want to give food to people this winter and then have nothing to give next year." Tessa set her mending in her lap and thought about that for a while. The fire settled. The storm outside, muffled now, pressed and receded. "Then we need goslings in spring," she said. "More birds. A bigger flock means more eggs, means more surplus in the cave. We could encourage laying in the chamber itself more than they're already doing. The temperature is right for it. They've already established nesting there. If we created more hollows, shaped some from the soft sections of the cave floor, that's a season's work at least." "Yes." She picked her mending back up. "Good thing we live here." He almost laughed. Not quite. It wasn't really a laughing situation, but the muscles of his face did something in that direction, and Tessa caught it and did something similar, and for a moment the weight of the winter was exactly its actual weight, and not the larger, more crushing weight of everything that winter represented, which was an improvement. The blizzard broke on the morning of November 19th, leaving the valley under 14 inches of fresh snow with a flat blue sky above it that had the particular cold beauty of Wyoming in hard weather. Rowan was outside before full light, hitching the mules to the delivery sled, packing the egg crates with straw, loading the first batch with care. 40 eggs for Mrs. Aldrich, 30 for the Gutierrez family on Flat Creek, 25 for the Pattersons. Tessa came out while he was doing the final loading, her breath smoking in the cold, the old wool scarf wrapped twice around her neck. "You pack the Aldrich crate on top," she said. "She's closest and most urgent." "I agree. I'm just noting it." She climbed up onto the sled seat and pulled the blanket across her lap. "You take the reins. My hands are better for keeping the load steady if we hit rough snow." He climbed up beside her. The mules leaned forward into their traces and the sled moved with a low whisper of runners on packed snow, and they went out through the gate and onto what passed for a road in this part of Wyoming. A track in summer, a suggestion in winter, navigable mostly by memory, and the slight differences in the way the snow settled over cleared ground versus open field. The Aldrich place was 3 miles northeast, up a shallow draw that drifted badly in a north wind. They'd get through it, probably. The mules had made worse in worse conditions. Rowan kept them moving at a steady pace that wasn't fast but wasn't cautious either. The middle speed of people who know their animals and know their road and are in a hurry for reasons that don't benefit from rushing. They were halfway to the Aldrich place when Tessa said, "What are we going to tell her?" "What do you mean?" "She's going to ask where the eggs came from. She's not the kind of woman who takes things without knowing the source." He thought about that. The mules blew steam into the cold air and picked their way around a drift that had built across the low part of the draw. "We tell her we had a surplus." "She'll know that doesn't add up. She knows what a homestead our size produces." "Then we tell her we had an unexpected surplus." "Rowan." He looked at her. "She's going to push," Tessa said. "And if she pushes hard enough, what do we say?" He watched the track ahead of them for a moment, the mule's breath rising and falling in the cold. We say we found a natural cold storage on the North Ridge. A cave. We don't say more than that. And if she wants to see it, then we tell her. When spring comes, we'll show her. When we understand it better ourselves. He paused. The point isn't to hide it forever. The point is to not hand it over to 20 people's opinions before we know how to protect it. Tessa nodded slowly. Okay. That's a reasonable answer. She might accept it. She looked at the snow-covered draw ahead of them. Mrs. Aldrich is a reasonable woman. Clara Aldrich was 61 years old and had been in Wyoming territory since she was 32, which meant she had outlasted an extraordinary amount of adversity through a combination of stubbornness and practical intelligence that had never once required anyone's approval. She met them at the door of her small stone house with an expression that managed to be both surprised and unsurprised at the same time. Rowan Mercer. She looked at the sled, then at Tessa, then back at the sled. Tessa. Morning, Mrs. Aldrich, Tessa said. It is morning. She stepped back from the doorway. Come in then, both of you. The inside of the house was cold. Not cold the way a house got during a bad night. Cold the way a house got when the wood supply had been rationed for too long, when the fire was being kept to a minimum because the alternative was running out before March. Rowan registered it immediately and didn't say anything. Neither did Tessa. They sat at her table and she put water on for coffee without asking if they wanted any, because offering coffee was a thing you did, and accepting it was a thing you did, and neither party needed to make it complicated. You drove out here in this, Mrs. Aldrich said, sitting across from them. Her hands were wrapped around a cup she'd kept from breakfast, still chasing its warmth. Roads weren't bad, Rowan said. The roads were terrible, and you know it. She looked at them directly. What did you bring? Eggs, Tessa said. The woman's expression shifted. Not softened. Mrs. Aldrich's face didn't exactly soften, but something moved behind it, something she was working to keep in place. We had a surplus, Tessa continued, more than we can use this winter. We didn't want them to go to waste. A surplus. Mrs. Aldrich said the word the way she might have said unlikely. Your homestead had a surplus of eggs going into December. We did, Rowan said, meeting her eyes. We found a cold storage situation on the North Ridge, a natural one, a cave that keeps a stable temperature. It's been preserving the flock's surplus since before we knew about it. We've just been harvesting what the birds had already set aside. She looked at him for a long moment. The water began to heat on the stove and made a small sound. A cave, she said. Yes, ma'am. On your property. On our property. Another silence. Mrs. Aldrich was not a woman who filled silence with unnecessary noise. She sat with it for a full 10 seconds, which felt longer, and then she said, And you came out here in 14 inches of snow the morning after a 3-day blizzard to bring me eggs from a cave. Yes, ma'am. She looked at Tessa. Was this your idea or his? Both of ours, Tessa said. She got up and poured the hot water and brought 3 cups back to the table. The coffee was thin, not enough grounds, and none of them mentioned it. How many did you bring? 40. The number landed in the quiet of the room, and Mrs. Aldrich set her cup down and looked at it for a moment, and then looked out the small window at the snow-covered yard and the gray sky above it, and something moved across her face that she didn't bother hiding, which meant it was too large to hide. That's a month of eating, she said quietly. More, if you're careful, Tessa said. They keep well in cold storage. Mrs. Aldrich didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, My woodpile. We noticed, Rowan said carefully. I'm managing. I know you are. I don't need... We have 2 cords in the back from the fall cut, Rowan said. I'll bring half of it up next run. Tessa and I don't burn that much. This was not strictly true, but he said it without inflection and held her gaze, and she looked at him with an expression that was 60% irritation and 40% something else, something that had been sitting under considerable pressure and was grateful, against its will, to have a small release. Fine, she said. Fine, he agreed. They stayed another half hour, drank the thin coffee, talked about the winter and the snowpack and what the spring might look like. When they stood to leave, Mrs. Aldrich walked them to the door and helped Tessa with her coat buttons, which had frozen slightly from the cold, and didn't say anything demonstrative or grateful, because that wasn't her way. What she said, as they climbed back onto the sled, was, "You two picked a hard place to put down roots." "We know," Rowan said. "Most people would have quit by now." "Most people aren't us," Tessa said. Mrs. Aldrich made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been something more complicated, and she stood in her doorway and watched them go until the sled rounded the draw and she passed out of their sight. The Gutierrez family on Flat Creek was next, and that was a different kind of hard. Marco and Elena Gutierrez had come west from New Mexico territory in the spring with 3 children, 2 boys, 7 and 9, and a girl who had just turned 5. And not enough capital, which wasn't unusual, and no prior experience with Wyoming winters, which was more of a problem. They'd filed on a quarter section near Flat Creek in May, gotten a decent stand of hay up in June and July, and then had most of their food stores damaged in August when the creek flooded their root cellar. Rowan had heard about the flood at the mill. He'd thought about riding out then and hadn't, and he'd been carrying that small failure of nerve since September. The Gutierrez place was small even by homestead standards, a one-room cabin with a lean-to for the animals. And when Tessa knocked, the door was opened by the older boy, who looked at them with the particular wariness of a child who'd been coached to be careful with strangers. "Is your father home?" Tessa asked. Marco Gutierrez appeared behind his son, a lean man with careful eyes and the specific posture of someone prepared to politely refuse whatever was about to be offered. He was 34 but looked older in the way the territory aged people, and he looked at the sled with the expression of a man who was trying to decide whether having enough pride to refuse help was a luxury he could still afford. "Mercer," he said, recognizing Rowan. "Morning, Marco." Rowan climbed down and extended his hand. "We were in the area, in 14 inches of snow. We had deliveries to make." He said it without apology, which was the right tone. "We brought some eggs. We had more than we needed, and they don't keep forever." This was not entirely true, but it was a version of the truth that allowed Marco Gutierrez to accept what was being offered without it becoming something he couldn't live with, which was the point. Marco looked at the sled, then at Rowan, then at Tessa, who smiled at him in the direct, uncomplicated way she had that didn't contain pity, just straightforward human acknowledgement. "Come in," Marco said. Inside, Elena Gutierrez was sitting near the fire with the youngest child in her lap, both of them under a quilt that had seen better days. She looked up when they came in with an expression that was very tired and very young at the same time, and she looked at the egg crate Tessa was carrying, and her face did something that she covered quickly by looking down at her daughter. They stayed 30 minutes, long enough to be neighborly, not long enough to make it feel like charity management. Tessa talked to Elena about the children, asked the girl her name, Rosaria, she said, barely above a whisper, and listened to the older boys explain the geography of their claim with the authority of children who have decided to take their situation seriously. When they left, Marco walked them to the sled and stood in the snow with his hands in his pockets. "I'll pay it back in spring," he said, "when I've got something to pay back with." "There's nothing to pay back," Rowan said. "There is for me." Marco said it quietly, without aggression, just as a statement of fact about himself. "Spring, whatever you need, labor, materials, whatever I have." Rowan looked at him for a moment. "All right," he said. That was what it needed to be. Not a refusal, not a negotiation, just the acknowledgement that the man standing across from him had his own form of accounting to keep, and that was his right. They drove to the Patterson place in the early afternoon, the light already beginning to slope toward the gray gold of a winter 4 o'clock. Dale Patterson met them at the fence with his oldest son, both of them coming back from some repair work on the frozen creek edge. And when he saw the sled, he took off his hat and turned it in his hands in the particular way of a man who was surprised and not sure what to do with the surprise. "You gotta be freezing," he said, looking at them on the sled. "We're all right," Tessa said. "Get in the house." He turned to his son. "Put their animals in the barn and get them some water." He turned back to Rowan. "Get in the house and we'll talk." The Patterson house was full and warm, 4 children in various stages of afternoon activity, a fire going hard, and Dale's wife Martha cutting up something at the kitchen table, who looked at the egg crate with the expression of a woman who had been running the numbers in her head for weeks. and had just been handed a different number to run. "Lord above," she said softly, which was the most anyone said about it, and it was enough. Driving home in the last light, the empty sled hissing over the snow, Rowan and Tessa sat close together against the cold. The mules moved steadily, tired but not spent, their breath rising in regular clouds. 3 households, Tessa said. 3 households. Martha Patterson didn't say 10 words the whole time we were there. She said more with her face. Tessa was quiet for a moment. The runners whispered on the hard-packed snow. The sky to the west had gone the color of copper behind the mountains. "We have enough for 2 more runs before Christmas," she said, "if the harvest holds." "It'll hold." "And after Christmas?" He watched the track ahead of them. The cabin was 2 miles out, a thin thread of smoke rising from the chimney where they'd banked the fire before leaving. "The flock starts heavy laying in late February," he said. "We keep the harvest going. We keep rotating the old stock out. The cave refills itself, Tessa. We just have to not take more than it gives back." She nodded, pulled the blanket tighter. The mules' ears moved in the cold and they kept their steady pace, carrying 2 tired people home through the last of the afternoon light, and the mountain sat dark against the darkening sky to the north, keeping its warmth inside, patient and certain, and full of what it held. December came in hard and stayed that way. The second blizzard hit on the 4th of the month, worse than the first. 3 days of sustained wind that packed snow against the north wall of the cabin to window height and buried the fence line entirely, leaving only the tops of the posts showing like the heads of drowning men. Rowan dug a path to the barn twice a day, and it filled in twice a day, and he dug it again without complaint because complaining about Wyoming weather was the same as complaining about the shape of the earth, a thing that didn't help and didn't change. Inside, they worked through the chores that winter demanded, and the ones they'd invented to stay useful. Tessa had started a new project, expanding her maps of the cave into something that could be considered a proper record, the kind of document that would mean something to someone who hadn't been there. She was careful about what she included and what she left out. Enough detail to understand the system, not enough for someone to find it without guidance. "You're making an owner's manual," Rowan said one evening, watching her work. "I'm making a stewardship document," she corrected without looking up. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "An owner's manual tells you how to use something. A stewardship document tells you how to take care of it so it's still there when you're done." He thought about that. "Who's it for?" She paused. "I don't know yet. Someone who'll need it after we're gone, probably. Or someone we decide to trust before that." She added a dimension to one of the hollow sketches. "We're not going to be the only people who know about this forever, Rowan. That was never realistic." "I know. So when we tell someone, and we will, they need to understand what it is and how it works, and what happens if you push it too hard." She looked up at him. "The cave isn't generous because it's magic. It's generous because the geese have been careful with it for longer than we've been alive. The moment somebody treats it like a mine instead of a partnership, it stops being what it is." He nodded, slowly. "Who do you trust?" She went back to her map. "I'm working on that." The second blizzard broke on the 7th, and they made their second delivery run on the 8th, this time adding 2 more households to the route. The Brennan family on the South Fork, who had 6 children and a father who'd broken his leg in October and been laid up since, and old Walt Hennessy, who lived alone in a dugout near the creek and who Tessa had been worrying about since the first snowfall. Walt Hennessy was 73 and had been in the territory since before the war, and had seen everything the country had to throw at a man, and was, in his own estimation, fully prepared to see whatever came next. He met them at the entrance of his dugout in a coat that had been patched so many times the original fabric was a minority of its total surface area, and he looked at the sled and then at Rowan and said, "What do you want?" "Nothing," Rowan said. "We brought eggs." "I don't take charity." "It's not charity. We've got too many and they won't keep past spring. You'd be doing us a service." Walt looked at Tessa. She looked back at him without expression, which was the right move. Walt was the kind of man who could smell performance from 50 yards and didn't respect it. "Fine," he said. "But I'm not pretending to be grateful." "We're not asking you to be," she said. "Good." He took the crate. "You want coffee?" "We can't stay," Rowan said. "We've got the Brennans still." "Danny Brennan's leg healing up?" "Slowly." Walt made a sound of general contempt for bones that didn't heal fast enough and took his eggs inside without further ceremony, which was, from Walt Hennessy, essentially a warm farewell. The Brennan visit was longer and harder in a different way. Nora Brennan was 31 and had the particular exhausted competence of a woman holding a household together alone. 6 children between 5 and 14, a husband who couldn't stand on one leg without pain, a fire that needed feeding every 3 hours to stay ahead of the cold. When they arrived, she was in the middle of 4 things at once, and she stopped all of them and opened the door and looked at the egg crate with an expression so unguarded that Tessa had to look somewhere else for a moment. "We heard about Danny's leg," Tessa said. "We thought we'd check in." Nora Brennan said something that was intended to be a proper response and got partway there. Then she pressed her mouth together and took the crate and said, "Come in," in a voice that was back under control. They stayed an hour. The oldest Brennan child, a girl named Lottie, who was 14 and had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn chin, showed Tessa the mending she'd been doing, a pile of it 3 feet high that she'd been working through systematically, and Tessa sat down beside her and they worked through it together while Rowan talked with Danny Brennan, who was propped up near the fire with his leg extended and looking like a man who had run out of patience with his own helplessness. "How bad is it?" Rowan asked. "Broken clean," Danny said. "Doc says it'll set right if I stay off it, which I haven't been able to do because there's 6 children and a wife and 3 months of winter." "You've been on it." "Of course I've been on it." Rowan looked at the leg, at the way Danny was holding it, the angle of his boot. "Does it hurt when you put weight on the heel only?" "Less than the rest." "Then move on the heel, short trips, barn and back, that's it. Let Lottie and your wife take the distance work." He paused. "I can come out once a week until the thaw. Check on the animals. Do whatever needs the full leg." Danny Brennan looked at him with an expression that was in some ways identical to Marco Gutierrez's expression in the snow at Flat Creek, the pride and the arithmetic running against each other. "I can't pay you," he said. "I'm not asking." "Rowan, I'll need help come spring with the fence line on the north quarter," Rowan said. 2 weeks of your time when you're healed up. That's the arrangement if you need one." Danny was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. From the back of the cabin came the sound of children arguing about something and then stopping, the argument resolved or tabled. "All right," he said. 2 weeks in spring." On the way home, Tessa was quieter than usual. Not the working through something quiet. The other kind, the kind that sat more heavily. "What?" Rowan said. "Nora Brennan's been mending that pile since October," she said. "Lottie's been helping since November. Neither of them said a word about it to anyone." "People don't." "I know they don't. That's what I'm thinking about." The mules moved through the evening cold, their breath marking their passage in white clouds. The sky had gone dark early the way it did in December, and the stars were out in the particular hard clarity they had when the temperature was well below 0. Close-looking, merciless, bright. "We can't solve everything," Rowan said. "I know that too." She pulled the blanket tighter. "But we can solve some of it. The egg situation. We have enough to keep 5, maybe 6 households through March if the harvest continues. But it's not just eggs, Rowan. Mrs. Aldrich needs wood. The Brennans need labor. Walt Hennessy is going to wake up one morning and need something we haven't thought of yet. So we check in more. We run the route twice a week." "In this weather?" "In this weather," he confirmed. "The mules can do it. We can do it." She looked at him. He was watching the track ahead, his face set in the patient, somewhat tired way it got when he had decided something and was simply waiting for the situation to catch up. She knew this face. She had married this face. "All right," she said. What neither of them said, and both of them understood, was that the route had become something more than deliveries. It had become a system, irregular and improvised, and held together mostly by stubbornness, but a system nonetheless. A web of contact and check-ins that connected 6 isolated homesteads across 20 miles of Winter Valley in ways those homesteads hadn't been connected before, because connection required effort that most people, in good times, didn't bother with. Hard times clarified what effort was worth making. The 3rd week of December brought something Rowan had not anticipated, people coming to them. It started with Dale Patterson, who rode out on a Thursday morning to return a seed catalog he'd borrowed in September, which was not why he came, the catalog being obviously a reason to come, rather than a reason in itself. He sat at their table and drank coffee. That was real coffee. Not thin, because Tessa had traded 3 jars of preserved vegetables with the supply wagon driver the previous month for 2 pounds of grounds. "I've been talking to some people," Dale said. He was a man who chose his words carefully, which Rowan respected. "About what you two have been doing, the deliveries." "It's not a complicated thing," Rowan said. "No, it's not. But it's a thing that's happening and a thing that's needed, and there are people in this valley who could contribute to it if they knew it was happening." He turned his cup in his hands. "Hennessy's got tools he can't use alone anymore. I've got grain I've been sitting on because I wasn't sure about my own stores, but if there's a network of—" He stopped, looked for the right word. "Mutual management. If there's something organized, even loosely, then the accounting changes. What I can contribute to a system is different from what I can spare on my own." Rowan looked at Tessa. She was looking at Dale with an expression of focused attention. "What are you suggesting?" she asked. "I'm suggesting that once a month, whoever can manage it meets somewhere central and puts on the table what they have and what they need, and somebody keeps track of it." He shrugged, a deliberate understatement. "That's all." "That's not nothing," Rowan said. "No," Dale agreed, "it's not nothing." The silence that followed was the kind where a thing was being evaluated. Its weight, its implications, the distance between where it started and where it could end up if you weren't careful. "The cave," Tessa said quietly. Rowan looked at her. "If we're building something like what Dale is describing," she said, "people are going to ask about the eggs eventually, where they come from, how many there are, whether there's a sustainable supply." She met Rowan's eyes steadily. "We've been saying we'd tell people when we understood it better. We understand it better now." "We do," he said. "Do we trust Dale?" "I'm sitting right here," Dale said. "I know you are," Tessa said, without apology. "Do we trust Dale, Rowan?" Rowan looked at Dale Patterson, who was looking back at him with the patient expression of a man who had been farming difficult ground for long enough to understand that trust was not given or asked for, but simply demonstrated over time, and who understood that the question was fair. "Yes," Rowan said. Tessa folded her hands on the table. "There's a cave on our north ridge," she said. "Natural cold storage. A crack in the limestone, big enough to get a sled through. The geese found it first." She laid it out in the plain, direct way she did everything. The cave, the temperature, the eggs, the system they'd developed, the discard margins, and the active nests, and the careful harvest rhythm they'd established over 8 weeks of steady work. Dale Patterson listened without interrupting, which was one of his better qualities, and when she was finished, he sat quietly for a moment. "How many eggs total do you think are still in the discard margins?" he asked. "At current harvest rates, we'll have usable supply through February," Tessa said. "March if the flock's winter laying holds. After that, we're depending on spring clutches and the margin accumulation from this season's eggs that we don't harvest." "So it's not infinite." "Nothing is," Rowan said. "But managed right." "Managed right," Tessa said. "It'll be there next winter and the winter after. Maybe for a long time. The geese have been running it for years without our help. We're just participating in something that already worked." Dale nodded slowly. "I won't tell anyone without your say-so," he said. "We trust you," Rowan said. "But yes, not yet." "Understood." He stood, picked up the catalog. "The meeting. First Thursday in January if the roads allow. My place. It's the most central." "We'll be there," Tessa said. After he left, the cabin was quiet for a moment, the way it got after a decision that couldn't be undone. Not bad quiet, just the weight of a thing shifting from one configuration to another. "You're sure?" Rowan asked. "About Dale?" "About all of it. The meeting, the cave, letting it become—" He searched for the word. "Bigger than 2 people." Tessa stood up and collected the cups and brought them to the basin. "It already is bigger than 2 people," she said. "It became bigger than 2 people the day we drove that sled to Mrs. Aldrich's." She was right. He'd known she was right before he asked. Some questions were less about not knowing the answer and more about needing to hear it spoken. He went out to check the animals in the early dark, moving through the cold to the barn where the mules stood in their patient, indifferent way, not caring about cave systems or valley networks or the moral arithmetic of what belonged to you versus what belonged to the place you happened to live in. They cared about hay and water and getting through the night. Rowan forked hay and thought about what Dale had called it. Mutual management. Not charity, not rescue. Management. The word implied something durable, something with structure and intention, something that outlasted the crisis that created it. He'd come to this valley 2 years ago with a wife and a pair of mules, and the particular ambition of a man who believed that if you worked hard enough and were stubborn enough and didn't ask for anything you couldn't earn, you would be all right. He still believed that. He believed it differently now, or maybe more completely. Because it turned out that being all right wasn't something you achieved alone, in isolation, by refusing to need anything from anyone. It turned out that the hardest and most necessary thing was knowing what you had and being willing to put it on the table alongside what everyone else had and see what the sum of it came to. He turned off the barn lantern and went back out into the dark. The cold was extreme and clean, and the stars were extraordinary, and the mountains sat to the north in complete black silence, enormous and indifferent, and holding its warmth inside like a gift it had been waiting a very long time to give. Tomorrow they'd run the route again. Patterson's, Aldrich's, Gutierrez's, maybe Hennessy's if the roads allowed. The sled was loaded, the eggs packed in straw, the cold room shelves still carrying enough to justify the trip. Not everything was solved. The Brennan children still needed clothes. Walt Hennessy's roof had a problem he wasn't admitting to. The cave system would need expanding in spring if it was going to serve what it was being asked to serve. And the winter was not close to finished. January and February waited ahead of them with everything those months typically had to offer in Wyoming, which was considerable and mostly unpleasant. But the route existed. The conversation with Dale Patterson had happened. The catalog with Tessa's careful maps was sitting on the shelf inside, a stewardship document waiting for whoever would need it next. Rowan walked back to the cabin through the cold and knocked the snow from his boots on the porch step, a habit so ingrained he didn't think about it, just did it. Inside, the lamp was on, and Tessa was back at the table with her maps. She didn't look up when he came in. She already knew it was him. He hung up his coat and sat down across from her, and the fire was good. And outside, the Wyoming night was as cold as it had ever been, and neither of them felt the need to say anything about any of it. January was the month that broke people, or didn't. It wasn't dramatic about it. January in Wyoming didn't announce itself the way the first blizzards did, with wind and spectacle and the sense of something arriving. January simply settled in, gray and absolute, and applied its weight consistently, day after day, until you either found what you were made of or discovered you were made of less than you'd hoped. The temperature dropped to 20 below on the 7th and stayed there for 11 days. The sky was the color of old pewter from first light to last, and the light itself lasted barely 8 hours and was never direct, just a general cold brightness that fell on everything equally and warmed nothing. Rowan ran the delivery route twice a week through all of it. There were mornings he stood on the porch before first light and looked at the thermometer nailed to the post and felt a specific kind of tired that wasn't about sleep. The mules were willing but not inexhaustible. The roads were packed ice under fresh snow and the sled handled differently in extreme cold. The runners contracted slightly and the steering went stiff, and you had to account for it constantly. Little adjustments, nothing dramatic, just the accumulated tax of moving through a world that was not particularly interested in helping you move. Tessa drove with him on the better days and stayed home on the worst ones, not because he asked her to, but because she understood the arithmetic. 2 people on a sled in a bad crossing of an iced creek was 2 people at risk. 1 person was half the risk. She hated staying home, and she never said so, and she had the fire going and hot food ready when he came back, which was the practical expression of something neither of them put into words. On the 14th of January, the day the temperature broke back above zero for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, he came home from the route to find her standing in the yard with her coat on, looking north toward the ridge. "What's wrong?" he said, pulling up the mules. "Nothing's wrong." She turned. "Go look." He unhitched the mules and put them in the barn and walked north through the juniper grove to the cave entrance, and he saw immediately what she'd seen. New geese. Not their flock. Or not only their flock. A second group, 6 birds, had arrived at some point in the past day or two and were in the process of being absorbed into the existing community of the cave with the complicated social negotiation that Geese conducted entirely in body language and proximity. The dominant female had already established her position relative to the newcomers. 2 of the 6 new birds had found hollows in the upper terrace. The other 4 were still sorting themselves out, He stood in the entrance of the cave and watched for a long moment in the warm, still air. 6 new birds meant more laying in spring. More laying meant more eggs in the discard margins by next fall. The cave was expanding on its own timeline, responding to whatever it was that drew geese to this particular crack in this particular mountain. Warmth, shelter, the accumulated evidence of successful nesting left by every bird that had come before. He went back to the cabin and told Tessa. 6, she said. 6. She was quiet for a moment, and then she wrote it in the catalog. Not in the map section. In the back, where she'd been keeping a running record of observations. January 14th, 6 additional geese arrived. Integration in progress. Upper terrace expanding. The cave is deciding to be bigger, she said. Seems that way. We should modify the second terrace ledge, create more viable hollows before spring laying starts. She was already making a note. Give the new birds established nesting before they've had time to decide somewhere else is better. He looked at her across the table, at the maps and the catalog, and the stub of pencils she'd replaced twice since October. She had dark circles under her eyes that had been there since November and showed no signs of leaving. Her hands were rougher than they'd been at their wedding, and she'd lost weight through the fall that she hadn't entirely put back on. She was also, without any question, more herself than she'd been at any point in the 2 years he'd known her. The territory had taken things from her the way it took things from everyone, but it had given back something in the exchange, a clarity, a settledness, a sense of purpose that fit her the way a well-made coat fit, conforming to the shape of the person wearing it rather than making them conform to it. He loved her with a kind of steady intensity that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with recognition, the specific feeling of being in the presence of someone who was exactly what they were, without apology or performance. He didn't say any of this. It wasn't the kind of thing that needed saying. It was just the truth, sitting in the room with them, as real as the fire and the cold outside and the cave in the mountain that kept giving. The January meeting at the Patterson place happened on the 16th, when the roads were passable, but not good, and 7 people came, which was more than Rowan had expected. Dale and Martha Patterson, Marco Gutierrez, Nora Brennan, without Danny, who still couldn't manage the ride, Claire Aldrich, who had driven herself 3 miles in a buckboard with the particular expression of someone doing a thing they'd decided to do and didn't require commentary on, Walt Hennessy in his patched coat, and a man Rowan hadn't met before, a younger homesteader named Cass Worthy, who'd filed on a quarter section east of Flat Creek in September, and wintered alone there, and who'd heard about the meeting from Marco. They sat around the Patterson table, and at first it was awkward, the way any gathering of independent people was awkward when the gathering was new and the rules weren't established. People talked about their stores, their animals, the road conditions. Walt Hennessy said almost nothing and communicated a great deal through facial expressions. Then Dale said, "Let's talk about what we have and what we need. Start with what we have." What they had, laid out plainly without the distortion of pride or embarrassment, was more than any of them had individually understood. Marco Gutierrez had lumber. He'd cut and seasoned wood in the fall that he didn't have a use for yet. Claire Aldrich had preserved food she hadn't mentioned to anyone, jars of last summer's harvest she'd been sitting on because she wasn't sure of her own stores and hadn't trusted the surplus until now. Martha Patterson had medical knowledge, learned from a mother who'd been a midwife that she'd used within her own family but had never thought to offer more widely. Cass Worthy had tools, a full smithing kit he'd brought west with intentions that hadn't fully materialized, sitting unused in his barn, and Rowan and Tessa had eggs. When Tessa explained the cave simply and directly, the system, the capacity, the sustainability, the room was quiet in the way rooms got when information was landing and people were processing it honestly rather than deciding what to think about it. Walt Hennessy said, "How long have you known about this?" "Since October," Tessa said. "You've been running that route since November." "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment with his particular unreadable expression. Then he said, "Good thinking," which from Walt Hennessy was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Claire Aldrich said, "What do you need from the rest of us to keep it going?" "Nothing yet," Rowan said. "In spring we'll need labor to expand the nesting hollows in the cave. 2 or 3 people, a week's work. Right now we need the route to keep running, which we're managing." "I can drive a sled," Cass Worthy said. My quarter section's east of Flat Creek. I can cover that end of the valley and save you the extra miles." Rowan looked at him. He was 25, maybe 26, with the particular combination of competence and uncertainty that came from being new to something large. He looked like he could be trusted. He also looked like he needed something to do that mattered, which was its own form of reliability. "You'd need to know the cave," Tessa said. "The harvest system, what to take and what to leave." "Then show me." She looked at Rowan. He nodded slightly. "Come out next week," she said. "We'll show you." The meeting ran 2 hours and produced something that wasn't exactly a plan and wasn't exactly a community, but was somewhere in the territory between them. A loose agreement about communication and contribution, about who could offer what and when, about checking in instead of waiting for crisis. No formal structure, no elected anything, just people who had looked at what the winter was costing them in isolation and decided that the arithmetic of working together was better, even accounting for the friction of working together, which everyone understood would be real. On the way home, Tessa said, "Claire Aldrich brought 3 dozen jars of preserved tomatoes. I saw. She's been sitting on them since August. Alone. I know. If we'd had this meeting in October, we would have had it when we were ready to have it," Rowan said. Not dismissively, just as a statement of how things worked. "If we'd called that meeting in October, half those people wouldn't have come. They weren't ready to sit at a table and say what they had and what they needed. It took the winter to get there." Tessa thought about that. The mules moved through the cold, steady, and reliable, and the stars were out again, the hard, bright January stars. "That's probably true," she said. "It's definitely true of Walt Hennessy." "Walt Hennessy wasn't ready to be cooperative in October of any year," she said. And this time Rowan did laugh, a real one, short and genuine, and it sat in the cold air for a moment before the wind took it. February came in slightly warmer than January, which in Wyoming meant it was merely difficult rather than punishing. The delivery route now ran twice a week with Cass Worthy covering the eastern end and Rowan and Tessa covering the west and north, and the system had developed its own momentum. People knew to expect it, which meant they had begun planning around it in ways that made the whole thing more efficient. Rowan and Tessa took Cass into the cave on the 2nd day of February, which happened to coincide with a morning when the light came through the juniper grove at a low angle and hit the entrance in a way that made the crack in the rock glow faintly at the edges. Warm light against cold stone. Cass stood in the entrance of the cave for a moment after they came through, and Rowan watched him process it. The warmth, the scale, the sound of the geese settling in their hollows, the way the candle flame went completely still in air that moved but didn't disturb. "I'll be damned," he said quietly. "Probably," Tessa said, not unkindly. "Come look at the hollows." She walked him through it the way she'd learned it herself, by observation, by attention, by the specific discipline of not reaching for the obvious conclusion before you'd earned it. She showed him the active nests and the discard margins and explained how to read the difference. She explained the temperature and why it mattered and what would disrupt it. She told him about the seam above the entrance brace and what to watch for. He listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that what was being given to him was more than information. It was responsibility. "How do you know I'll treat it right?" he asked. "We don't," Tessa said plainly. "Not for certain, but you asked the question, which is a reasonable starting point." He nodded. She handed him a small notebook, similar to the catalog but shorter. "Keep your own record, harvest dates, counts, what you observe in the birds, anything that seems different from what I've described." "You're building a library, ma'am," he said, looking at the notebook. "I'm building something that outlasts us," she said. Hopefully. The spring came, the way springs came in Wyoming, not gradually, not dramatically, but in argument with itself. Warm days collapsing back into late storms, the ground thawing and refreezing, the creek rising and then quieting and then rising again. March was a month of constant recalculation. But the geese didn't care about recalculation. The geese knew what they knew, which was that the cold was loosening its grip and the laying season was beginning, and they operated on that knowledge with complete conviction regardless of what the weather was doing. By mid-March, the cave had 16 active nests between the original 11 birds and the 6 who'd arrived in January. By the end of March, it had 22, because 6 more birds had arrived from somewhere north and been absorbed into the colony with the same matter-of-fact competence the dominant female brought to everything. The day Rowan and Tessa worked the second terrace, clearing debris, deepening existing hollows with the careful hand tools, adding 8 new ones where the stone was soft enough to work, was the first truly warm day of the year. They worked in their shirt sleeves, which felt like a different life than the one they'd been living since October. And when they finished in the late afternoon and came out through the entrance into the spring light, the valley below them was beginning to show the first pale green of new growth along the creek. They sat down outside the entrance, backs against the rock, in the warmth that the stone had been holding and was now releasing into the air. The geese moved in and out around them without concern. "We made it," Tessa said. Not triumphantly, just as a statement of fact, in the same plain voice she used for everything. "We did," Rowan said. "All of them made it. Aldrich, Gutierrez, Brennan, Hennessy." "Patterson's pig didn't make it," Rowan said. "The pig doesn't count." Dale would argue that. She smiled. A real one, the kind that reached the corners of her eyes and stayed there for a moment. "We made it," she said again. Not louder, not with more force, but with something added to it. A kind of wonder at the ordinary fact of having come through. Not clean, not without cost. Danny Brennan's leg had healed crooked and would give him trouble for years. Walt Hennessy's roof had in fact been a problem, solved in February with Marco Gutierrez's lumber and Cass Worthy's tools and 2 days of cold, ugly work. Clara Aldrich had lost 2 of her chickens to the cold in January and hadn't told anyone until March, and when Tessa found out, she'd been quietly furious about it in the way she got when people refused help past the point of reason. There were things that the winter had taken and didn't give back, small damages and medium ones, the ordinary accounting of a year in a place that didn't accommodate carelessness. But the valley had come through, and it had come through differently than it would have if 2 people hadn't followed their geese into a mountain in October. "I've been thinking about something," Rowan said. "You think about things constantly. You'll need to be more specific. When we were making the cave work, the early weeks, I kept asking myself why." He was quiet for a moment, watching a goose settle into the entrance with the confident ease of a bird that had been doing this for years. Not why we did it. Why it worked. Why the geese had been running a system that worked for longer than we'd been alive. Why the cave held its temperature. Why the eggs kept all of it. And I kept coming back to the same thing. "Patience," Tessa said. He looked at her. "They weren't in a hurry," she said. "The geese. They found a good thing, and they worked with it instead of against it. And they took what it gave and left the rest. And they did that season after season until it was just how things were." She picked up a small piece of limestone from the ground and turned it in her hand. "We almost didn't do that. When we first saw the eggs, I watched you calculating. I was calculating too. How many? How fast? How much?" "I remember. That was the dangerous moment," she said. "That was where the whole thing could have gone wrong." She set the stone down. "If we'd been hungrier, if we'd been more afraid, if we'd been people who looked at something that was working and decided the way to make it work better was to take more from it." He understood what she was saying. He'd been thinking the same thing in different words for months. The idea that the cave's generosity was not a property of the cave itself, but a property of the relationship between the cave and the creatures who used it. That generosity was not a fixed quantity, but a renewable one, dependent on restraint, on reading what a system could sustain and staying inside that boundary even when you needed more than the boundary allowed. He'd thought about this in relation to the cave and in relation to everything else. The valley. The people in it. What you built when you built something together. How much of its strength came from what you put in and how much from what you chose not to take out. "You know what I didn't expect," he said. "What?" "That giving food away would make us feel more stable, not less." He thought about how to say it right. "When we were sitting on everything, calculating every week whether we had enough, that felt like being very close to the edge of something. But when we started the route, when we started putting things on the table, I felt more solid. Not because we had more, because we were part of something that was bigger than just the 2 of us." Tessa looked at him for a moment. "You could have said that in October and saved us both some anxiety," she said. "I didn't know it in October." "No," she allowed. "Neither did I." The valley spread below them in the March light, still winter pale, but with the green coming, insisting on itself in the way that spring insisted, patient and irresistible. 6 miles south, the Gutierrez children were probably in the yard. Walt Hennessy was probably doing something with the tools he claimed he didn't need. Cass Worthy was probably on the east end of the route, doing the job he'd taken on with the seriousness of someone who'd found something worth being serious about. The first Thursday meeting in March had 14 people. Rowan hadn't known there were 14 homesteaders in reasonable reach of the Patterson place, which told him something about how isolated they'd all been. Not just through this winter, but before. The meetings had become the thing Dale Patterson had imagined them becoming, a place where the accounting was done honestly, where what was needed and what was available were put alongside each other and compared. It was imperfect. People still held things back. Walt Hennessy still communicated primarily through expressions of contempt. There were minor conflicts and one significant argument between Danny Brennan and Cass Worthy about the fence line between their properties that took 3 weeks to resolve and left both of them irritable about it even after. None of it was clean, but it held. That was the thing. It was imperfect, and it held. The cave flock was 28 birds now. Tessa had lost count of the egg count somewhere in February and switched to estimating more than enough, approaching substantial, needs careful management. Her catalog had expanded to a second volume, a proper notebook she'd bought from the supply wagon in March, and her maps had been redrawn twice as the cave changed and the nesting colony grew. Cass Worthy had filled his own notebook. Clara Aldrich, who had come to see the cave in late February after asking 3 times in a way that made clear refusal was not an option, had kept notes in her own hand that were different from Tessa's. More observational, more about the birds themselves, less about the eggs. Tessa had read them and added a note to her own record. See, Aldrich observes that dominant female appears to navigate the cave differently in late February. New mapping behavior? Watch for changes. The cave was accumulating witnesses. It was accumulating people who understood it and cared about it and would, in ways Tessa hoped for without being able to predict, carry that understanding forward. That was the thing she'd meant when she called it a stewardship document. Not the maps themselves, the people who read them. One evening in late March, after supper, Rowan walked to the north end of the property alone. Not for a reason, just because the evening was warm enough to be outside without your coat for the first time since September, and the air had that specific smell that Wyoming had for about 2 weeks every spring, cold water and new grass and the mineral edge of thaw. A smell that was better than anything. He stood at the edge of the juniper grove and watched the cave entrance in the last light. The geese came out in 2s and 3s the way they went in, unhurried, flowing back across the property toward the yard, heading home with the same certainty they'd always had about where home was and what it asked of them. The dominant female came last, as she always did, checking, adjusting, departing only when she was satisfied with what she left behind. Rowan watched them go and thought about that October afternoon when he'd stood in almost this same spot and watched them disappear into the side of a mountain, and the fear and the curiosity had been balanced so evenly inside him that either one could have won. He'd always thought of himself as a practical man, a man who dealt with what was in front of him, who trusted what he could measure and touch and verify. He still was that. But he'd learned something this winter that the practical framework didn't quite cover, that the best things were often things you couldn't verify in advance. You couldn't know that following the geese was the right decision before you followed them. You couldn't know that giving food away would make you more stable, not less. You couldn't know that sharing a secret made it stronger instead of weaker. You could only decide what kind of person you were going to be about the uncertainty and act accordingly and see what came of it. What had come of it was this: a valley that had barely known itself was beginning to. People who had wintered in isolation were choosing, imperfectly and sometimes grudgingly, to winter in connection instead. A cave that had been a secret was becoming a shared responsibility, a homestead that everyone, including Rowan and Tessa themselves, had suspected might not survive, was standing intact in the first warmth of spring. None of it was finished. Nothing real ever was. There was work to do in the cave and work to do on the fence line, and Danny Brennan's labor debt to collect, and a barn roof that had waited through the entire winter and was still waiting. The valley would have hard winters again, probably harder ones because the territory didn't run out of hard winters. There would be people who couldn't be reached and problems that didn't get solved in time and losses that left marks. But the thing that Rowan understood, standing in the last light of a March evening with the geese moving past him and the mountain at his back, was that none of that negated what had been built. Hard things coming didn't unmake good things made. The wound didn't cancel the healing. What had been given was given. What had been grown was real. What had been learned lived in the people who'd learned it and would come out of them in future winters without them having to plan for it. The territory would take. It always did. But this valley had learned in one long, difficult winter that it could also give, that the giving and the taking were not in opposition but in conversation, and that the conversation was worth having was in fact the only conversation worth having. He walked back to the cabin in the dark, hands in his pockets, unhurried. Tessa was inside at the table with her new notebook, making notes by lamplight, probably about the cave, probably about something she'd noticed that day that needed recording before the details blurred. He sat down across from her without interrupting her. The lamp was steady, and the fire was low, and outside the Wyoming night was mild for the first time in months, and the mountain sat to the north in the dark, as it had always sat, patient and warm inside, full of what it held and ready to give it, to the people who were willing to receive it the right way. Tessa looked up from her notebook and looked at him, and something passed between them that didn't have a name, the specific, unglamorous, irreplaceable thing that two people built between them when they'd come through something together and were still, improbably and gratefully, sitting at the same table. "Good evening," she said. "Good evening," he said. She went back to her notes. He sat with the fire and the quiet, and outside the geese settled in for the night, and the valley held its people in the dark, imperfect and intact, and the mountain kept its warmth as it always had, not for any particular reason, just because that was its nature. And nature, when you worked with it instead of against it, had a way of being enough.